Ladies and gentlemen, if you think today's headline is just silver touched a new high, if you think this is just another shiny run-up that cools off the moment the Fed changes a sentence or a ceasefire hits the ticker, then you're staring at the smoke while the house is already on fire. Because what I'm about to lay out is not a cute chart pattern, and it's not a feel-good forecast either. It's a chain reaction. It's the kind of setup that starts quietly in vault reports and procurement contracts, and then suddenly shows up as factory delays, busted delivery promises, and a price that doesn't ask your permission. And here's the scary part. By the time the mainstream financial media starts treating this like an emergency, the positioning window is usually gone. That's how these things work. They whisper first, then they roar. Now, real quick, my analytics show most of you watching right now still haven't subscribed. If you value original work and you want to help me push back against copycat channels, hit subscribe and comment John AG so the algorithm knows you're with us. Also, if you want daily updates, quick posts, instant voice notes, and my personal analysis that I don't always share on YouTube, I've set up a WhatsApp channel for the community. The link is in the description, so join it and stay ahead of the next move. All right, jumping in, the story you're hearing is that silver is strong, targets are rising, and some big institutions think we could see a major price level by spring. Fine. But the real story is why spring matters at all, and why the market could go from tight to unhinged faster than most people can process. Because this isn't only about investors, it's about industrial users. It's about supply chains. It's about a strategic material that modern civilization quietly burns through every day like oxygen. And if you think that sounds dramatic, let me ask you this. What happens when something is essential, hard to substitute, and suddenly hard to source? Do prices gently drift higher, or do they snap? Now, before we go deeper, a quick note that a lot of you have asked for. If you like hearing silver-related success stories from real people, how they built discipline, how they positioned early, how they stayed calm, there's a separate channel linked in the description. Give it a look and subscribe over there too, because seeing what others have achieved is fuel when the market gets emotional. Okay, let's make sense of what's happening. The easiest way to understand this is to stop thinking about silver like a trade and start thinking about it like a bottleneck. A bottleneck doesn't have to be huge to cause chaos. It just has to be narrow enough that demand can't flow through it. Silver is used everywhere, but it's used in small amounts per product, which is exactly why people underestimate the risk. A little here, a little there, a smear in solar paste, a thin contact in electronics, a component you can't skip because it carries current reliably. When you add up a little here across billions of devices and millions of vehicles and entire power grids, you don't get a little problem, you get a structural one. Now, one of the most dangerous myths in markets is that if price goes up, supply will show up. Sometimes, yes. But that depends on time. It depends on permits. It depends on capex. It depends on skilled labor and refining capacity and political stability. In other words, it depends on a world that behaves. And the world is not behaving. So here's the setup. For years, the global silver market has been leaning on a simple trick. Pull metal from above ground inventories to cover shortages when mine supply and recycling can't keep up. That works until inventories are drained. And once you drain the buffer, every small shock becomes a big shock. This is why the vault conversation matters so much. It's not because vault numbers are fun. It's because vault numbers tell you how much pain the system can absorb before something breaks. And if you've been watching closely, you've seen those numbers moving in a direction that should make any serious industrial buyer nervous. Now, the script you're being fed in many places is that silver reserves are fine, or delivery mechanisms will handle it, or there's always metal somewhere. That kind of talk is what people say right before the market discovers the difference between paper availability and physical availability, because paper can be created in infinite quantities. Physical cannot. Now let's talk about the United States for a moment, because this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. There was a time when strategic planning meant stockpiles, not because somebody wanted a nice spreadsheet, because leaders understood that if global trade gets messy, your factories and your defense systems can't run on good intentions. They run on inputs. So stockpiles existed, not as an investment, as insurance. Then complacency hit. The world felt stable. Now, the old threats seemed distant. And like every era of comfort, people started selling the insurance to make the budget look better. That decision doesn't feel painful when prices are low and supply is flowing. It feels efficient. But it becomes a nightmare when conditions change. Because here's the part nobody wants to admit. When you liquidate strategic metal during a low price era, you don't just sell metal. You sell options. You sell resilience. You sell time, and time is the one thing you can't buy back during a shortage. Now, the consequence today is that the United States is far more dependent on external flows than most people realize, and dependence is not automatically a problem until someone else controls the spigot. This is where the conversation intersects with global policy. When refining, processing, and export pathways become concentrated, the country controlling those pathways gains leverage. They don't even need a dramatic ban. They can apply friction. They can require licensing. They can redirect output domestically. They can prioritize their own manufacturers. And every small tweak creates large ripple effects in a tight market. Now, you might be thinking, okay, John, but what about recycling? What about substitutes? What about technology improvements that use less metal? Those are real forces, but they are slow forces. And in a fast-moving supply squeeze, slow solutions don't save you. They arrive after the damage. Recycling takes time and collection. Substitution takes redesign. Redesign takes testing, certification, and production retooling. And for many applications, substitutes don't perform the same way, which means you can't just swap materials and call it a day. So when industrial buyers realize the pipeline is getting thinner, they do what they always do. They lock in supply. And that's when the market changes character. Because in a normal market, buyers order what they need. In a fear market, buyers order what they might need. And that might is how shortages accelerate. This is why spring matters. Not because spring is magical, because spring is when procurement cycles collide with visibility. Contracts get negotiated, production schedules get finalized, and if a company cannot secure silver at predictable terms, it has to choose between paying up, slowing output, or risking a shutdown. And if you think a major manufacturer will gamble on a shutdown to save a few dollars an ounce, you don't understand corporate risk management. They will pay. They will overpay. They will pay anything compared to the cost of stopping a multi-billion-dollar operation. Now, here's a key point that most people miss. Even big price jumps in silver don't always translate into a huge percentage of the final product cost. So a manufacturer can tolerate much higher silver prices before it truly destroys demand. That means the usual demand destruction threshold is higher than people assume. So if price needs to rise to ration demand, it may need to rise a lot. Now, let's bring in the target talk. When you hear a major institution float a spring price level, don't treat it like a promise, and don't treat it like a fantasy either. Treat it like a signal that the pressure is visible inside professional models. Institutions are rarely brave early. They get brave when the math is already leaning one way. But here's the catch. The neat target assumes an orderly process. It assumes no shock. It assumes the delivery systems remain trusted. It assumes buyers don't panic and exchanges don't get strained. And markets love to break the orderly assumption at the worst possible moment. So let me ask you a second question for the comments. Do you think the next explosive move in silver starts with investors piling in because of headlines, or with industrial buyers panicking behind the scenes because they can't source what they need? Tell me which you believe hits first, and why. Because whichever hits first tends to pull the other in after it. Now let's talk about exchanges and deliverable inventories in plain language. There's a difference between metal in storage and metal available for delivery. Available for delivery means it's allocated, it's warrantable, it's ready to move. In tight periods, that category can shrink fast because the metal that can be delivered is exactly the metal people demand. And when deliverable inventory drains, the paper market can still quote a price, but the price becomes less meaningful because the ability to settle physically becomes more constrained. That's when you get the nasty features of a squeeze. Premiums detach, spreads widen, delivery delays extend, and smaller buyers get squeezed out first. It becomes who has relationships, who has allocation, who can pay immediately, and who can stomach uncertainty. And when that happens, the screen price becomes the beginning of a negotiation, not the end. Now, one more important note. By the time you're watching this, the members-only video should already be up. It collects the latest updates into one place, and for premium members, we go deeper with more detailed analysis. If you want that, join the membership and check the members-only upload, because it also shows me who's really following closely. All right. So, what's the big picture? The big picture is that silver is not just an investment story. It's an infrastructure story, it's a security story, it's a supply chain story, and the reason the price action can become violent is that the world doesn't have an easy substitute, and it doesn't have an easy way to increase supply quickly. That means price has to do the work. Price has to ration. Constraint disappears when new supply arrives or demand collapses, and the odds of either happening fast are low. Now, let me be clear. None of this requires you to believe a perfect story. You don't need to believe every rumor. You don't need to accept every projection. You just need to understand the math of tightness. You just need to understand what happens when essential input meets limited availability. You just need to understand that when procurement managers panic, they don't tweet, they buy. And by the time you see the tweet, the buying already happened. So here's what I want you to do right now as we wrap this up. First, subscribe if you haven't, because we're going to keep tracking this as it develops, and you'll miss critical timing if you only catch this randomly. Second, join the WhatsApp channel in the description for daily updates, voice notes, and quick alerts. Third, if you want the complete update pack in one place, join the membership and watch the members-only video that's already live. And finally, comment below. Do you think the next big leg up is triggered by investor FOMO or by industrial panic? And if you want to support the anti-copycat campaign, drop our John AG in the comments so the algorithm knows you back original work. Because the truth is, this story is moving whether people pay attention or not. Inventories don't refill because you ignored them. Procurement cycles don't slow down because you hoped they would. And policy doesn't reverse the time lag of building supply. The clock is ticking. And if spring is when the broader market finally wakes up, then right now is when the smart positioning happens, quietly, before the noise. Now, let me walk you through why this specific moment feels different, because the details matter, and the details are where the cliffhangers live. People hear strategic reserve and they imagine a neat pile of bars sitting quietly, like a museum exhibit. But strategic reserves, when they are real, are not decoration. They are a shock absorber. They are what keeps your industrial base running when the world stops cooperating. And the United States used to understand that. Back in the era when planning meant more than slogans, silver was treated like a strategic input. Not because it looked nice, but because it performed. High conductivity, reliability, corrosion resistance, a small component that prevents big failures. And when you're thinking about defense systems, satellites, secure communications, precision electronics, and power distribution, small component is not a small problem. It's a single point of failure. So the US accumulated meaningful quantities over time, and the point wasn't to time the market. The point was to never be hostage to the market. Then the world changed, or at least people believed it changed. The Cold War mood faded, budgets got political, and the quiet assumption took hold that global trade would always deliver what you needed, right when you needed it, at a fair price, forever. That assumption is the most expensive belief of the last 3 decades. Because once that belief took over, the logic became, why store metal when you can store dollars? Why hold inventory when you can rely on just-in-time supply? Why keep insurance when you can save a little money this quarter? And that's how strategic material becomes excess. That's how reserves turn into a line item to be liquidated. That's how a nation sells its umbrella because the sky looks clear. But umbrellas aren't for clear skies. Now, the key point in this story is not whether those decisions felt smart at the time. The key point is what they produce today. A loss of strategic depth. When you hear that the strategic position has collapsed by roughly 73% from its historical peak, that isn't a poetic phrase. It's a description of capacity. It's the difference between having a buffer and having none. It's the difference between absorbing disruption and being forced to pay whatever the market demands. And yes, price is the part people focus on. You see silver around $92 an ounce, and your brain wants to simplify it into up or down. But the more important question is, at that price, can a major buyer actually source scale? Because if the answer is not easily, then price becomes the wrong reference point. Availability becomes the reference point. Now, this is where the story gets spicy. When reserves shrink and dependence grows, you start competing with everyone else at the exact moment everyone else is also getting nervous. Industrial users don't buy like retail. They don't buy because a chart looks bullish. They buy because their production schedule demands it, and they hate uncertainty. So when they sense uncertainty, they do the one thing that makes the uncertainty worse. They try to lock in more than they need. That's the beginning of hoarding. And hoarding isn't driven by greed. It's driven by fear of disruption. Now, layer in the global deficit dynamics, because deficits are the silent killer. In a balanced market, an inventory draw can be temporary. In a deficit market, an inventory draw is a lifestyle, and the market is living off savings. And every year of deficit eats the savings further. When you have several years in a row where demand exceeds supply, even if the gap changes year to year, you're draining above ground metal that used to act as a cushion. And once the cushion is thin, every small shock gets amplified. Now, according to the general supply-demand numbers being discussed in the market, global demand has been running well above what mine output and recycling can comfortably cover. You'll hear figures that put demand around the 1.2 billion range, with total supply closer to the 1 billion range, leaving a gap that can look like 200 plus million ounces in a single year. And the exact number isn't even the main point. The main point is the direction and persistence. 5 consecutive deficit years is not a cycle. Now let's talk about the exchange side without getting lost in jargon. An exchange can show a large number for total inventory, but not all inventory is equal. Some metal is spoken for. Some metal is in the wrong category. Some metal is eligible, but not offered. And what the market truly cares about, especially during stress, is the portion that is registered and ready for delivery, because delivery is the moment of truth. Delivery is where paper meets metal. And if you've been watching the trend in registered inventory, the story has been one directional, down. There are figures circulating that show registered inventory having fallen massively from earlier peaks. And the more shocking part is how fast it can drain during a single heavy demand window. Because in a tight environment, a large withdrawal in a short time doesn't just reduce availability, it changes psychology. It tells the market, somebody needed real metal and they took it. And once that signal hits, other buyers don't want to be the last one at the window. There was a recent period where more than 33 million ounces were reported as being pulled for delivery in roughly a week. That's not a rounding error. That's a warning light. And here's the cliffhanger. If that pace of withdrawals continues into a major delivery month, what happens to the credibility of settlement? Because settlement credibility is the foundation of pricing. Now, let's connect this to the spring timeline again, because spring is not just a season, it's a set of deadlines. Manufacturers plan production in cycles, they sign contracts, they lock materials, they set delivery schedules, and if they cannot secure inputs, they have to revise output. That's a business crisis, not a chart event. So the reason spring targets get attention is because spring coincides with procurement moments where contracts collide with reality. And when reality is tight, contracts get renegotiated at higher costs. And when reality is scarce, contracts don't get filled at all. That's when panic begins. Now, let's bring in the bank target everyone keeps repeating. When a major bank points to a spring level around 135, the way you should hear that is not, wow, nice upside. You should hear it as they think the market needs a much higher price to balance, because price is the lever that reduces demand or increases supply. But increasing supply quickly is hard. So what's left? Price rising until some demand can't justify itself. Now, here's the uncomfortable reality for people who assume demand will vanish. Many critical uses can tolerate higher prices because silver is a small fraction of the final cost. So they keep buying, they keep paying, they keep pushing. And that means demand destruction, if it comes, might require much higher prices than people expect. Now, let's add the geopolitical lever, because this is where tight markets become dangerous markets. If a major refining hub tightens export licensing, raises requirements, or filters who can ship out refined silver, the impact can be immediate, even if the rule sounds technical. Because when refined silver is concentrated through a few processing centers, access becomes permission-based. And permission-based supply is not free market. It's controlled. Now, you'll hear discussion that new licensing thresholds have been implemented that only large, well-capitalized refiners can meet. On paper, that sounds like quality control. In practice, it can shrink the number of exporters quickly. And if the number of exporters shrinks, the number of buyers who can secure metal shrinks. And if buyers can't secure metal, they scramble. And when buyers scramble, premiums blow out. This is how a policy lever turns into a price lever. Now, let's talk about the United States again, because dependence matters. If a country consumes far more silver than it produces, it must import. And imports are not guaranteed. They are relationships. They are contracts. They are shipping lanes. So if the U.S. has to import the bulk of its silver, and if the refining chain is concentrated, and if inventories are draining, then the U.S. has a vulnerability problem. That's the simple conclusion. And once that conclusion becomes undeniable, planners start making moves. They negotiate supply deals. They encourage domestic production. They accelerate permits. They quietly compete with private buyers. But here's the brutal truth. Even if they do everything right, they are late. And this is where the buyback math becomes brutal. Imagine a government once unloaded metal in a sleepy market when prices were single digits, and now it's staring at a world where silver trades near triple digits before you even talk about premiums and delivery fees. You don't need to be an accountant to see the problem. Replacing the same ounces costs multiples more, and that's before you're buying, itself pushes the price higher. Let's use simple scale thinking. If the goal was to rebuild even a fraction of what existed decades ago, you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of ounces. But the market doesn't have that sitting on a shelf, waiting politely. In many years, the entire world's mine output isn't much more than 1 billion ounces, and a big chunk of that is already spoken for by industrial demand and long contracts. So if a large official buyer steps in and tries to source size, they're not just buying. They're competing against solar manufacturing, against EV production, against electronics, against data centers, against every industry that can't pause and wait. That's why a government stockpiling program doesn't calm a market like this. It tightens it. Now, here's the cliffhanger. If official buyers start negotiating long-term supply directly with miners and refiners, what happens to the open market float that everyone else relies on? It shrinks. And when float shrinks, volatility rises because fewer ounces are available to absorb shocks. This is also why the 135 by spring idea can be conservative. Not because somebody wants hype, but because the market may need more than a modest repricing to convince marginal demand to step aside. If critical buyers can tolerate higher costs, then price has to go higher to do the rationing. And if you're thinking, sure, but surely the exchange will handle delivery, remember this. Exchanges don't create metal. They manage claims. When claims collide with physical limits, the rules change. Margins go up. Settlement incentives appear. Timelines stretch. And the public learns in real time that a promise and a bar are not the same thing. So the question isn't whether silver can go up. It's whether the system can stay calm while it does. And keep an eye on the demand mix because it's getting more stubborn, not less. Solar panels don't ask permission before they consume silver paste. EVs don't run without reliable contacts and control systems. High-performance computing and AI hardware keep scaling, and those servers don't get built out of wishes. Even upgrades like 5G, grid modernization, and advanced medical devices quietly sip silver the way a city sips water, constantly. That's why silver can rise a lot before the average consumer feels it directly. In many products, the silver content is a small slice of total cost, which means manufacturers can keep buying even as price climbs. They'll complain, they'll squeeze suppliers, they'll try to thrift ounces, but they won't stop, not unless the market forces them to. So when you hear demand destruction, ask the real question. At what price does it actually begin? And if you guess wrong, you learn the lesson the hard way, like everyone else. Now, this is where the 73% collapse becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a story of lost optionality. In the past, if supply tightened, there were buffers. There was slack. Today, slack is smaller, and when slack is smaller, prices behave like a spring. You press on one side and it snaps on the other. Now, if you're still with me, here's the next cliffhanger. What if the next big move doesn't start with a headline at all? What if it starts with a quiet procurement rush that drains the last deliverable inventory, and then the headline appears after the fact, when the market is already repriced? Because that's often how the real moves happen. The public sees the smoke after the fire spread. Now, I'm going to say something that will irritate some people. When you see the mainstream narrative suddenly screaming, sell now, or this is the top, you should consider the possibility that fear campaigns are designed to shake out weak hands. That doesn't mean every warning is wrong. It means incentives exist. Now, I also want to fold in one more community piece because we're building something bigger than a one-off video. If you're doing well and you've got a success story, drop it again in the comments. It can be one sentence. People need to see what's possible, especially when the headlines are designed to scare. And while you're at it, if you're supporting the original work and the anti-copycat push, leave that Our John AG comment. It's simple, but it helps more than you think. All right, moving on to the what happens next question, because this is where retention lives. In my view, there are two broad paths. In the calmer path, price rises, premiums stay elevated, and the market clears at higher levels while supply tries to respond slowly. In the messy path, inventories drain faster, delivery stress increases, and the market experiences sharp spikes and air pockets as participants scramble and exchanges tighten rules. The difference between those paths is confidence. And confidence can crack quickly if physical availability keeps tightening. Now, there's a reason the spring timeline keeps coming up. It's a calendar of stress points. It's not mysticism. So if you're watching the market, spring procurement and major delivery windows are periods where you want to be extra alert to inventory changes, premiums, and any talk of delays. Now, let's put the price levels into a human framework. 92 is not the end. It's a signal. 135 is not the end. It's a stress marker. And in a disorderly scenario, overshoots happen. That's what panics do. But here's the key. After an overshoot, the market doesn't necessarily return to the old world. Sometimes the old world is gone. If the market reprices because it realizes supply is structurally constrained, then the baseline changes. The floor moves. And that's why this isn't just about catching a spike. It's about recognizing a regime change. Now, you might be wondering what to do with all of this. First, keep your emotions out of it. Emotion is expensive. Second, stay informed. That's why the WhatsApp channel exists, because the fastest changes happen between uploads. Third, watch the physical signals. Premiums, delivery times, allocation language, inventory categories. And fourth, decide what your plan is before the market gets loud. Because loud markets are the worst time to invent a plan. Now, I'm going to wrap this up by bringing the whole argument back to a single simple idea. Silver is scarce in the way that matters. It is scarce in deliverable form. It is scarce at scale. It is scarce under time pressure. And scarcity under time pressure is what produces violent repricing. So don't get distracted by daily noise. Don't let headlines make you forget the structural math. Watch the buffers. Watch the flow. Watch the behavior of real buyers. Subscribe, join the WhatsApp channel in the description, check the members only update if you want the full deep dive, and drop your comment. Investor frenzy first or industrial panic first? And if you're supporting original work and the fight against recycled content, type RJohnAG below. I'll see you in the next video.